Assalamu alaikum, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to another amazing Tuesday session. We've been waiting for days for the next segment of Surah Ahzab. It's been so incredible, and the jury's out whether we'll finish today, but inshallah, we're looking forward to another super session. I just wanted to share something that someone shared with me earlier today. It was an Instagram post that was shared by Yaqeen Institute, and it's a powerful bit of information from their research, which is interesting because I think if you ask sort of the average Muslim, based on like appearances and marketing and just overall where things are, people would probably say Yaqeen Institute is one of our best, in terms of what the Muslim community has to offer in terms of, professionalism. They have really nice infographics, they're colorful, they have a lot of Muslims on their board or, as part of their organization. And so this was fascinating. They did a whole infographic. It's called Raising Doubt. And the statistic is that 1 in 4 is the number of Americans who are raised as Muslims who report no longer identifying with Islam in adulthood, predominantly moving towards atheism or no religion. 1 in 4, which is, a pretty huge number. I would have thought that would have been more than that. And, you never know how research statistics are, but I was fascinated to see like what the reaction would be. So of course I read comments and I kind of dug a little deeper to see, okay, what is this based on? And it's based actually on a research paper by Dr. Osman Umarji called Can Childhood Experiences Predict Religiosity and Doubt in Adults? It's an empirical analysis of Muslims, and apparently they did a lot of surveys and so forth. But what was interesting is, a lot of the comments, and I think people were surprised. They wanted to know what the sources were, but there was one comment that stuck out to me, which I thought I would share, which is there are entire movements of ex-evangelicals and ex-Mormons. Most of us were raised to be very devout. For a lot of us, our doubts arose because the things that we were being taught conflicted with our values as human beings. Some of us continued in our faith, but in a newer, truer way. Others left our faith entirely. This definitely isn't an issue that is unique to Islam, which is, completely true. And I thought I would share, so this whole infographic goes on to explain, okay, what is doubt? They can be hard doubts, soft doubts, religious doubt. Nothing that is actually surprise to anyone. I mean, we live in an Islamophobic age. All kinds of things create doubt, and I think that if anything, it's a more serious doubt than ever before because we're getting thrown a lot of information that is very specific about our faith, about our prophet, peace be upon him, about Islam, a lot of contradictions and so forth. So I was sort of also interested to see, okay, well, what does Yaqeen Institute say about what are the practical lessons that we can learn from this? Like, what are some of the solutions to this? And so the solutions are that for parents, and again, remember that the research question is, can childhood experiences predict religiosity and doubt in adults? Which, I actually would argue is not really, it's an interesting question, but I don't think that that's a relevant question because whether or not you had good or bad childhood experiences, it doesn't change the reality that we live in today and how Islamophobia has changed in our time, in our recent times, as opposed to, what you might have been raised with 20, 30, or fewer years ago. But what do they say as practical lessons that we can learn from all of this? For parents, you can set up your children for long-term religious contentment by modeling consistent religious values, providing a high-quality religious education, avoiding harsh and overly strict attitudes and punishments, emphasizing the importance of faith in a warm and compassionate way, channeling their children into positive religious experiences, and encouraging strong friendships with other Muslim children. So it's a basic, I don't think there's anything that is surprising here. And then for adults who seek to decrease their own sense of doubt may find it helpful to 1, develop strong friendships with other Muslims, 2, avoid actively anti-Islamic content online and elsewhere, 3, dedicate themselves to daily prayer, 4, prioritize internal reasons to have faith and avoid external pressures, 5, find teachers who can adequately address lingering questions. And 6, participate in positive religious experiences. Again, nothing really surprising here, but the thing that really jumps out to me is sort of the obvious point, is that religion has to make sense. It has to address the issues that we face. We have to know what our Quran it means and says, and how it's relevant to what the challenges that we face in our time. And so it's just sort of highlighted again to me the specialness of what we do here, because I feel like all of this stuff, they probably spent a lot of time and effort to come to these very, very basic common sense conclusions. And it's fine, it's important to have evidence to back these kinds of things up, but what actually moves the meter and changes the reality, and what actually addresses, when Muslims decide they don't see anything interesting in Islam for them, and they turn to either atheism or they move away from religion, what we're talking about is, what is it that actually will convince you that Islam has something to offer, that the Quran has actually something to say that is intelligent and relevant and and effective for your world. I mean, how so this is what is missing, I believe, that, and it's almost like it's even missing in the discussion. Like, all of this is premised on the idea that we understand like the Quran in a particular way, that there's no nuance, there's no place for sophistication, there's no way to sort of, really, that the Quran is all the same whether you get it from one source or another. And what we've learned here is obviously that that's not true. And, so these kinds of things, this is the best that our, community has to offer right now. And to me, it feels like a bit of a kindergarten education, because we need to dig a lot deeper and understand at a much deeper level what our book actually has to say. And it has to be something that is compelling, in our day and age, for smart people, intelligent, thoughtful people, people who, think of themselves as sophisticated. And those are not the terms that I would necessarily use to, address like how we as a community are approaching either our book or the problems that we face. And we talk about all this stuff here. But so, to address like, okay, what is the solution? And I hope that people will just take, an opportunity to share with others that, look at the project Illumine. I know it's hard to watch 6 hours or 3 hours or 10 hours, however many hours we've spent on any particular surah. But hopefully as a Muslim, there's at least one surah that has piqued your interest, whether it's Surah Nur, Surah Baqarah, whatever people love, Yasin, whatever. Just pick any surah and just try to engage a little bit with, one of these halakas, and then see what the difference is. Because part of our challenge is convincing people that the Quran actually has something different to offer than what they hear at the mosque, and what they, what common knowledge might be. Because I think what we cover here is absolutely stunning. It's unprecedented. It's obviously never been, like this approach of even a thematic unity to a surah is something completely original and new to our tradition. And this is the game changer. So, we're always, for me, I'm always thinking about, okay, how do I convey to people that what we're doing is not what everybody else is doing? That this is not just a run-of-the-mill tafsir that you can get no matter where you tune in or wherever you go. It's not all the same. So, hopefully if people are on social media, they're following our Instagram posts, we're trying to, drop really powerful quotes, excerpts from the khutbah and from the halakha. All of these things hopefully are planting seeds for people for when they're actually ready to search. But, these kinds of research models just sort of emphasize to me how far away we are from even like addressing, okay, what is really going to prevent people from leaving this faith? It's that this religion has to offer something bigger, better, more reasonable, more rational, more interesting, more compelling, and relevant to what's going on. So for that, anyway, I am so excited to continue on our journey with Surah Al-Ahzab. I know last time we covered a lot of historical stuff, but we covered a lot of things about, for example, even the Prophet's wives that no one has ever heard before. We've never delved into anywhere else. So I know what we do here is really special. And I'm so excited to continue, and I hope people will invite their friends to join us on this journey, because it's such an incredible journey. And thank you so much, Sheikh, again, for sharing all of your lifetime journey with all of us. So thank you for being with us, and look forward to another amazing session.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Subhanallah al-Ali al-Azim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الأطهار الطيبين وعلى أصحابه المختارين وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Okay, so Surah Al-Ahzab so far we started out with the rather remarkably humbling Quranic command to the Prophet ﷺ, Ya ayyuhan nabi ittaqillah, that simple, straightforward command that human beings, when a human being, an average Muslim today, if you tell them something like that, they take exception to it. But Surah Al-Ahzab in itself is in surah that in many aspects is, while centering the Prophet ﷺ, placing the Prophet in the center of everything, it also at the same time is very humbling towards the Prophet ﷺ, as we will see. Anyway, so Surah Al-Ahzab, as we've talked about, begins with this, then moves on to what I refer to as the construction of reality, the way we engage with commitments, and the way we engage with what becomes a frame of reference, what becomes determinative points demanding deference in our lives. In other words, what we define in our lives as mattering, as what matters and what doesn't matter. And then it moved from there to an example, of course, a lived example of what which is the name of the surah itself, the battle of the Confederates or the Ahzab, the anti-Muslim alliance, which, as we all talked about, is centered around the whole, what's often called the Battle of the Trench or Ghazwat al-Khandaq. And having addressed how Muslims, whether Muslims of strong faith or Muslims of compromised faith, responded to this extreme test of their commitments and of their will, then it moved on to a matter of social dynamics, but not necessarily yet matter of public social dynamics, but the social dynamics relevant to the Prophet ﷺ himself and the role of the Prophet and the family of the Prophet. And as we've talked about in the context of the Battle of the Trench, there is also the expulsion of the tribe of Banu Qurayza from Medina. And in the course of this discussion, I mentioned that there are many historical ambiguities. I mean, and we've gone through a number of them. Whether, you know, narratives about the role of someone like Abu Lubaba, and whether it's accurate or historically accurate or not historically accurate, or the Sa'd ibn Mu'az, the role of someone like Sa'd ibn Mu'az, and so on and so forth. I expressed very strong doubts about the narrative of the massacre, the whole narrative of Sa'd ibn Mu'az ruling, according to many of these stories, ruling per Jewish law that the men of Banu Qurayza be executed, and that the women and children be enslaved, and there are. This is a much larger topic, but among other things, it's just very noteworthy that the narratives, these narratives, end up the tenor, the tone, the substance of these narratives have the clear effect of actually making Banu Qurayza, who are supposed to be a very treacherous tribe, a tribe that stabbed Muslims in the back, actually end up looking heroic. And Muslims, I mean, it's fair to say they end up not looking very good. The narratives don't go into a lot of details about the executions other than to emphasize the bravery of Banu Qurayza and so on. But there are a couple of things. One thing I forgot to mention, Lina Salameh, who's a very good academic, a Palestinian Israeli professor, wrote in her book, Beginnings of, it's called New Beginnings? The beginnings of Islamic law. She actually discusses the historiography of the incident with Banu Qurayza, and then Steve Conley sent me a message, an article by Walid Arafat called New Light on the Story of Banu Qurayza and the Jews of Medina. This is a 1976 article. I actually haven't read this article, probably because it's 1976. Anyway, then there's an Israeli academic, Mir Kester, who responded to Walid Arafat's article, apparently in 1986, with an article called "The Massacre of Banu Qurayza: A Re-Examination of a Tradition." It was published in the Jerusalem Studies in Arabic and Islam. And then an article that I have seen by Munir Muhammad, and Munir Muhammad is a good scholar. It was published in 2016, titled "Some Reflections on the Story of Banu Qurayza, a Re-Evaluation of Ibn Ishaq's Account," and it was published in the Islamabad Law Review in 2016. And Munir Ahmed rebuts Mir Kester's rebuts the rebuttal of Mir Kester's rebuttal of Walid Arafat. So you have originally Walid Arafat, and then Mir Kester, and then finally Muhammad Munir in 2016. Can you pass this to Rami? And of course, the Lina Salama discussion in her book, The Beginnings of Islamic Law, and I don't think we've been able to find, although I know I have a copy of it in my archives somewhere, of the thesis that was written by Galal Keshk's son at John Hopkins about this the historiography of this incident and so on. I mean, if I think it is fair to say that the one cannot take as a historical fact that 600 or 700 men were put to death after the Battle of the Trench from the tribe of Banu Qurayza. There was, at the same time, there is evidence that certain of the leaders of Banu Qurayza were executed, but that would be 6 or 7 executions. Now, it wouldn't be historically surprising, considering what conduct was involved, and considering the laws of war and the Near Eastern legal systems at the time, leave alone legal systems all around the world, it would not have been a surprise if, in fact, the fate of Banu Qurayza would have been, as the narratives of Sa'd ibn Mu'az claims. But nevertheless, although it would not have been historically surprising, when you look carefully at where the narratives that Ibn Ishaq ultimately adopted, because all of this comes from Sirat ibn Ishaq. And Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, when you look at where he took the original narratives about the fate of Banu Qurayza, it makes you extremely suspicious. And then we have figures from Banu Qurayza, male figures from the nobility of Banu Qurayza, who pop up in narratives about the Battle of Khaybar, or in the migration of Jewish narratives about the migration of Jewish tribes to Yemen, to Sham. If the men were executed and the women and children enslaved, there would be no migration to Yemen or to Sham. But yet we have cumulative narratives about migration of members from the tribe and the survival of the tribe of Banu Qurayza itself, which is, again, a lot of historical ambiguities. And then we came to, as we said, that the fate or the victory sometimes could be quite dangerous, because in the same way that extreme circumstance test people's mettle, victory could infect people with a considerable amount of hubris and a considerable amount of overconfidence and a sense of entitlement about. And here, interestingly, we don't have the same social tensions that we saw in Surah An-Nur or even in Surah Al-Anfal about the division of the spoils of war. It's quite likely that this is a situation in which those who stuck by, who remained vigilant and who stuck by principle and fought till the end, was such a distinct group of people. And the retreat of the Confederacy and Confederacy, anti-Muslim Confederacy, the way it crumbled and fell apart was so miraculous, so unpredictable. And coming in the aftermath of Surah An-Nur, we just don't have the type of narratives where people would go to the Prophet ﷺ and say, you know, why aren't we getting bigger spoils of war or a bigger share of the spoils of war? There was, I am sure, if you try to put yourself, to reimagine the historical situation, you can imagine that all those who retreated and went back, quote unquote, to protect their homes, are in a very awkward position and in a very strange position after the siege failed. And they are, you know, they would be worried about rehabilitating their reputation and rehabilitating their position after such a major victory. However, as we've talked about, it is interesting that it is within the household of the Prophet ﷺ where there's a sense of, okay, you know, isn't it time that our lives become easier? And again, when you look at what was actually being demanded, I mean, it's not that much it's not that much if you are considering what royal homes or emperors or what, but decisively for the Prophet ﷺ, the very idea that within his household there would be individuals that are demanding a greater share of dunya is unequivocally unacceptable. And as we've talked about, there's an ultimatum, and the ultimatum doesn't come from the Prophet ﷺ, it comes from God. But the delivery of the ultimatum, and I didn't really get into this last halaqah, the delivery of the ultimatum and this is something, unfortunately, it's not sufficiently emphasized or focused on, is that the Prophet ﷺ doesn't come and deliver the ultimatum in a harsh way. You can imagine it is possible to come and say, okay, listen, here's what God is saying, and you're either going to stay with me on, these conditions, or here's the door. The way he delivers the ultimatum is rather noteworthy. Many of the narratives say that he begins with Aisha, and he tells Aisha, there's something I want to talk to you about. and I want to talk to you about it, and I don't want you to give me an answer right away. I want you to consult with your parents, think about it, and then give me an answer. And he communicates not just the verses, but basically he says, if you choose to separate, I will ask God to bless, to give you everything in this world that you desire. But if you choose to remain with me, then you have to understand that this path will not get easier. And Aisha chooses, she refuses to consult with her parents and says, I know the answer right away, but he meets with each of his wives and gives them has the same conversation. The reason I emphasize this is that these little indications, these little adilla of the personality of the Prophet ﷺ are, in my view, of greater significance in identifying for us the sunnah of the Prophet, the path of the Prophet, the example of the Prophet, than the type of events where we have great difficulty establishing the historical facts because they were historically burdened events. And what I mean by historically burdened is that they were events in which there were vested political and social and other interests in tweaking the narrative one way or the other. The narratives that seem to have been reported through history, uncontested, so they're narratives that are simply transmitted without anyone noticing that they deserve to be contested. These narratives, and that give us a sense of the Prophet ﷺ as a human, not as a public figure, but as an individual. So narratives, for instance, about his dhikr, narratives about the way he would joke with someone, narratives about casual conversations he's had with this person or that person, are extremely significant in understanding these micro details are extremely significant in unpacking the moral example of the Prophet, because narratives about whether he married X person or whether he freed X person, or you will often find these narratives hotly contested with a great deal of inconsistency, and you will identify strong vested interests in the narrative, in the various competing narratives. And we saw, and although I didn't emphasize it from this perspective, but we saw an example of this in that although Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first, the articulation of a special status for the wives of the Prophet, and while it is an historically inaccurate to say, and although you find it in a lot of texts written by modern Muslims, that the wives of the Prophet were excluded. They were told to prefer to they were told to presumptively it's like saying, you know, be mindful of your status in society and your place in society and the role that you need to play in society, and be mindful that you are not like any other person. But we continue, if the wives of the Prophet needed to exit their homes for one reason or another, if they needed to get something done, they did it. So it is not true that somehow the imposition of the hijab on the wives of the Prophet became a die-hard exclusion, as some modern Muslims imagine it to be. And we saw that this remarkable statement, إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. Allah's intention is for Ahlul Bayt. Now, literally, Ahlul Bayt is the haram, the sanctity or the sanctuary of the Prophet ﷺ. Anyone within that circle, that sanctuary, is a part of Ahlul Bayt. And Allah alerts everyone associated with this Ahlul Bayt that the very framing of purify you and keep away all risks, is all forms of defilement, all forms of contaminants, all forms of evil or unbecoming. Anything unbecoming is part of what is. But risk has something that is the connotation of something that is morally compromising. By the language here, the moral example that the family of the Prophet ﷺ has a role to play in society, while they are definitely not a part of the prophecy, but they have a special status in society. They have a role of moral leadership, moral mentoring, as we'll see in a bit. Okay. I think that, and then this is where and then 35. إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات والقانتين والقانتات. Let's see how interesting. So, okay. So Muhammad Asad translates as, verily for all men and women who have surrendered themselves unto God, and all believing men and believing women, and all truly devout men and truly devout women, and all men and women who are true to their word, and all men and women who are patient in adversity, and all men and women who humble themselves before God, and all men and women who give charity, and all self-denying men and women, and self-denying men and self-denying women, and all men and women who are mindful of their chastity, and all men and women who remember God unceasingly. For all of them, God has ready forgiveness of sins and a mighty reward. So, what is special about this particular ayah is the specification of men and women. The rule in Arabic is that using the masculine form, unless the context specifies other words, the masculine form is used for both masculine and feminine. So a lot of Arabic poetry is written in the masculine form. This is not because it is written from a man to a man. It is because the masculine form can be used to refer to the feminine. Even like a lot of Kulthum's songs in classical Arabic, although she's a woman, the poet who wrote the poet who wrote the poetry that Kulthum is singing, the poet was a man, and he writes the poem in the masculine form. Of course, these songs were not written for Kulthum. They were written long before Kulthum was even born. But when she sings them, they sound like they were made for her because she's a woman. But when you remember that this poetry was actually written by a man in the masculine form, and that's a normal practice, that unless the context specifies otherwise, the masculine form refers both to masculine and feminine. So what is unusual here is that the Quran specifies al-Muslimina wal-Muslimat, Muslim men and Muslim women, al-Mu'minina wal-Mu'minat, believing men and believing women, wal-Qanitina wal-Qanitat, truly men and women who are truly mindful of God, as-Sadiqina wal-Sadiqat, again, truthful men and truthful women. Now, we have a range of interesting narratives in the background of this ayah. And let me see what did I write it down. Yeah. Now, some versions of these narratives say that it was wives of the Prophet ﷺ who, like Salama, in a group of narratives, it says that it's Salama. That Salama, other narratives say no, it was other wives. Some narratives say it was 2 or 3 wives. Basically, they all go and say to the Prophet, ﷺ, why is it that Allah mentions men in the Quran and doesn't mention us women? ما لنا لا نذكر في القرآن كما يذكر الرجال. other group of narratives say that no, it wasn't wives of the Prophet, or it wasn't just the wives of the Prophet, but it was women in the community like Ammar al-Ansariya. And here the language differs. So Ammar al-Ansariya, for instance, is reportedly says, ما أرى كل شيء إلا للرجال وما أرى النساء يذكرن بشيء. Her language is a little bit less polite, I think. Not impolite, but just less. So she saying, it's like saying, man, why is it that I notice the Quran is only interested in men and not interested in women? And as I've said before, when you have as many reports, all of them communicating the same idea, they probably allude to, now, because of the different versions, so there was some momentum. Whether that momentum started with wives of the Prophet and then supported by women from the community, or started by women in the community and then echoed by some wives of the Prophet. But this voice of, we want to make sure that the Quran is acknowledging us women. Now you pause for a second and you know right away that there is a lot in the historical context that is missing and possibly irretrievable. Why? Because we know that the Quran, for instance, in Surah Al-Mujadala, already responded to women. So it is not true that the Quran hasn't mentioned us women. We know that the Quran did. And in fact, when Allah is saying to a woman who's arguing with her husband and then, talking to, complaining to the Prophet, and Allah says, Allah has heard what you're saying, that is a direct channel from God to a woman's voice. But here you suspect that there is something additional going on. We know that there's a lot of the tradition that show us that there was a tension, which we've already mentioned, about the women's norms of the women of Medina versus the more conservative norms of the women of Mecca. And as I mentioned before, there is a reason for that. Women of Medina were, a lot of their social norms were the norms of working women. Women who had to actually leave the house and do things to survive. Women of Mecca still had the classic Qurayshi issue of the norms of aristocratic women versus the norm of low-class working women. And the norms of aristocratic women is to do less and appear less and engage less. And as we know from reports that remarkably survived, and it is rather remarkable that they survived, that whether, the Omar ibn al-Khattab is made as the prototype of the objecting male, but that individuals like Omar ibn al-Khattab are often cast as protesting the role that women. So, for instance, that I have all these narratives where Omar ibn al-Khattab is objecting to the fact that women are walking walking in the streets when it's dark, or walking in the streets as they're going to Fajr before the sun is up, or that Umar ibn al-Khattab reportedly says, I have for long wished that Allah would impose the hijab, and finally Allah answered my prayers. And for instance, you have some reports, whether they're historically authentic, I have very serious questions about that. But that the Umar ibn al-Khattab tries to notices that the wives of the Prophet are walking the streets at dark, and he tries to scare Sauda to get a point across that the streets are not safe. And it's even the narrative is a little bit comical, because he tries to scare her by jumping in front of her in the street. I have very serious doubts that when you have someone constantly picked as put in this sort of prototypical role as in a sort of a theatrical fashion, as the person who's always carrying the torch of the single cause of let's put women in their place. And at the same time, you could accept it if it didn't jive with other reports in which Omar is presented in a very different light. Anyway, there is clearly a tension, and the tension is that the Prophet ﷺ supports the active role of women in society. So even in the Battle of the Trench, while so many men withdrew, there are women who, like in the Battle of Uhud, women who stood their place, refused to withdraw, and became quite famous and quite well known for the prominent role they played. Okay. So, and at the same time, we know from Surah An-Nur and from Surah Al-Ahzab, as we will see in a second, that with you have a society that on the one hand, it's an open society because it is open to converts. It's open to people coming from the desert saying, we're Muslim and we want to be with you. But on the other hand, any society that has to worry about hypocrites, a class of people that you can't trust within, a society that has to worry about consistent betrayals by outsiders who signed the covenant with you and then broke their covenant and then joined your enemies, and at the same time constantly have to worry about an external threat, while you have openness, that openness brings a lot of danger and a lot of risk. And that is reflected in all these reports. The Ayyar and Shuttar reports. The Ayyar and Shuttar reports are reports that as women in Medina are playing these active roles, going, leaving their homes 5 times a day to go to the masjid, going, attending any meetings or meetings in which the Prophet is speaking, playing a role in the Battle of Badr and the Battle of Uhud and in the Battle of Ahzab. You also have elements that, whether unsavory local native elements or migrant elements that came to Medina from the outside, in other words, often described simply as Bedouins, that came to Medina. Now, whether they came to Medina thinking, well, maybe, we can get something of the spoils of war, nominally saying they're Muslim, but what we see from Surah An-Nur and Surah Al-Ahzab and numerous reports is that there is also a harassment of women in open spaces in Medina. And a lot of the prototypical narratives attributed to Omar, their response to this harassment is, well, women should play a less public role. But the Prophet ﷺ refuses to say anything that, in fact, would limit the role of women publicly. And importantly, when what is commonly known as Ayat al-Hijab, the verse on hijab, comes, it doesn't come to address all Muslim women. It's limited to the wives of the Prophet. And it's prefaced, the preamble of it, to it says, لَسْتُنَّ كَأَحْدٍ مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ, you are not like other women. So although we have a lot of these narratives, and Fatma Mernissi, for instance, makes a very big deal of these narratives, where she says, which I don't accept, by the way, her interpretation of the history, that that the Prophet was sort of had a progressive outlook and wanted women to have an active role, and then the Ayat al-Hijab is revealed, and conservative elements in society win, and now women are secluded after the Ayat al-Hijab. The problem was this narrative, and she relies on a lot of these traditions that respond to Ayat al-Hijab, celebrate the revelation of Ayat al-Hijab as if Ayat al-Hijab commanded the seclusion of all women. But note, this is a really important point, that it does not say all women. It says only the wives of the Prophet. And even then, as I said, it is not a complete seclusion, because the wives of the Prophet continued to, and as we saw in the Sauda report, for instance, that we talked about last time, continue to go out on, whether they're going on Hajj, going to Umrah, if they had a reason to go, they went. They continued to attend prayer, for instance, as well. So Ayat al-Hijab is not about, and again I'm emphasizing, is not about Muslim women in general. It is about only the wives of the Prophet by the language of the ayah itself. Okay. However, what do we make of the fact that we have these narratives in the tradition that although the terms of Ayat al-Hijab says وَقَرْنَ فِي بِيُوتِكُنَّ وَلَا تَبَرَّجْنَ تَبَرُّجَ الجَّاهِلِيَّةِ الْأُولَى, prefacing that يا نساء النبي لستن كأحد من النساء, you are not like other women, and it addresses its commands to the wives of the Prophet. What do we make of the fact that there are extrapolations on these ayat in Surah Al-Ahzab that apply to the wives of the Prophet, extrapolations that effectively read these ayat as if they apply to all women? What you make of it is that clearly there were social tensions, in that it is absolutely true that in all likelihood, that whether, as I said, Omar is always placed as the prototype of this orientation, but that there were, with events like the siege, with all the turbulence that taking place, there were males that wanted women to play a more secluded role, or wanted to strictly limit the role that women played. Allah responds to this by limiting the role that the wives of the Prophet play. This must have had a reaction. When I read these traditions that try to twist the arms of these verses and say they apply to all women, what that tells me is that it is an indication of a historical social dynamic where there were pressures to indeed limit the role of women. In all likelihood, as a reaction to these pressures, women came to the Prophet ﷺ and wanted assurances that they are fully validated. And whether it is in fact came from women in the community, like Amir al-Ansariya, or from the wives of the Prophet, you can imagine, they know that the Quran has acknowledged women, and they are aware that when you speak in the masculine, unless the context... But what does that mean when you have these traditions that tell you, oh, why is it that God only mentions men? What do these traditions indicate? They indicate that there is a social momentum saying we want to be validated. But why do you want to be validated? Well, you want to be validated in response to a momentum that wants to negate you, or invalidate you. So part of this, I imagine that part of this is that now, so you have this, a after Ahzab, after seeing that a lot of the men ended up being a disappointment, at an increasing active role for women, I can imagine that collectively you've heard a higher voice by women. And what the Quran comes and says, part of this voice is illegitimate. And that the part that's illegitimate are the women that turn their increased social role, or if you will, into a demand for material things. And concretely, they go to the Prophet and say, we want more. But the part that is legitimated by the Quran is the moral validation of women. So, look, right after you have 33 telling wives of the Prophet to avoid the tabarruj of Jahiliyyah, and that Allah wants to purify Ahlul Bayt, and then underscoring in 35 and 34 that wives of the Prophet focus on the hikmah and the revelation. In other words, focus on the ethical teachings that are being conveyed and repeated and emphasized in your households. Then right after that, 35, we get that moral validation, explicit moral validation of the role of women, but not the role of women not that aspect where they are saying we want material things, but in the moral function they play in society. In other words, their role as moral examples in society. So, qanitin, or let's use a feminine form. القانطات الصادقات الصابرات الخاشعات المتصدقات الصائمات الحافظات الذاكرات. So it is like, and I think if people would have, it's like saying you are as a moral value in society, as a moral guide within society, you have an equal role to play. Because when it comes to what matters to Allah, there is no compromise on that. Truth, that what Allah expects from men in terms of sacrifice and in terms of diligence and in terms of living by principle and in terms of being soldiers of God, Allah expects from you women as well. So you have your obligations, your status, what is expected from you is in no way mitigated by your gender or watered down by your gender. Okay. And then we get to 36 and 37. Let me just, before I move. Oh, no, I did forget what. Okay. Um, there is a. Um, there is in Tafsir al-Qurtubi a passage that I've always thought has caught my attention. I just, it's really interesting. Let's see, I hope I can find it. So this is uh, it's a passage I would say of historical curiosity. Okay, so Qurtubi, maybe uh, someone can help me find it. Qurtubi is talking about how the the wives of the Prophet ﷺ are, ordered to avoid, to be especially keen about avoiding tabarruj. And of course, we've already mentioned that tabarruj generally, and tabarruj, as we said, is to to make it a point to display one's physical attributes, to draw attention to to oneself, and how the tabarruj is wrong. And then Qurtubi says that in his travels, he has never seen women more modest than the women of Palestine, and especially Jerusalem. So I want to find this passage because it's very, especially these days when Muslims have all like to pretend like Palestine never mattered, and that Jerusalem doesn't matter anymore. You know, as I, everything in my being tells me that if Muslims, as long as Muslims continue saying Jerusalem doesn't matter, they will remain cursed by Allah. Allah will never bless anything they do. Okay. The key in Qurtubi's text, Rami, if you're looking for it, is the word Nablus, because he talks about his visit to Nablus. It's Ibn Arabi, so,
He's quoting Ibn Arabi.
but it is in Qurtubi.
That's right.
You see people who know like computer stuff, it's like they save so much time. This could take me hours just trying to find. It's just like Rami's just like in 2 minutes, not even 2 minutes. Okay. قال ابن العربي لقد دخلت نيفا على ألف قرية. So he says Ibn Arabi, yeah. So he's reporting. So Ibn Arabi says, I've entered maybe more than 1,000 villages. فما رأيت نساء أصوًا عيالا ولا أعف نساء من نساء Nablus. So, but he says, I've never seen women who are more modest and pure than the women of Nablus, of course, in Palestine. Um, فما رأيت امرأة في طريق نهارا إلا يوم الجمعة فإنهن يخرجن إليها. So he says that he doesn't see women in the streets except on Fridays, because on Fridays all the women come out to um, go pray. And إلا يوم الجمعة فإنهن يخرجن إليها حتى يمتلئ المسجد منهن فإذا قضيت الصلاة وانقلبن إلى منازلهن لم تقع عيني على واحدة منهن إلى الجمعة الأخرى وقد رأيت بالمسجد الأقصى عفائف ما خرجن من معتكفهن حتى استشهدن فيه. So he's saying that all the women, he doesn't see them in the streets except on Fridays when they all come out to Friday prayer. And then they disappear from a Friday to Friday. So basically all the women just come out to Friday prayer. Which again, by the way, just note, when I mentioned to you earlier that it's only in the modern age where we made Friday not relevant for women. That's a modern invention. It's not because it's clear historically that women would always go out to the mosque on pray Fridays. And then he says that, and then he saw women in the Aqsa Mosque. They remained there. They secluded themselves in the Aqsa Mosque until they were martyred in it. Of course, he's referring to their martyrdom during the Crusades. Anyway, yeah, because then خلافة الأمر الرسول حين خرجت تقود الجيوش. Anyway, um, uh, okay. So now, remember that part of this journey, while Allah made very clear that it's important to note, because we that part of our discussion about the construction of reality is what in Surah Al-Ahzab is very clear and what is not clear. And while Allah makes very clear the ethical, the application of ethical roles to women, don't forget our discussion about the considerable ambiguity about who precisely the Prophet married, والسلام, when, whether whether the last marriage was in the seventh Hijri year, whether there were, and we'll come back to this. But anyway, now we come to another point of a historical event that deserve pause and reflection. So verse 36, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَنْ يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ وَمَنْ يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا مُبِينًا. That if Allah and the Prophet decide something, a true believer should not have a choice. Okay. Then 37, we get to the actual historical incident with Zayd. So let's see how Muhammad Asad translated it. And O Muhammad, thou didst say unto the one to whom God has shown favor and to whom you have shown favor, hold on to your wife and remain conscious of God. And thus would you hide within yourself something that God was about to bring to light. For you did stand in awe of what people might think, whereas it was God alone of whom you should have stood in awe. And then when Zayd had come to the end of his union with her, we gave her to you in marriage, so that in the future no blame should attach to the believers for marrying the spouses of their adopted children when they later have come to the end of their union with them. And thus God's will was done. Okay, so this is, of course, one of the famous events. We've talked about Zayd ibn al-Haritha, that initially he was the Prophet's adopted son, and that then in Surah Al-Ahzab, Allah comes and says, you can't give them your name. So he is given his original name from his biological lineage, Zayd ibn al-Haritha, rather than Zayd ibn Muhammad. And the reference in 37, which is one of the big favorites of Islamophobes, by the way, and Orientalists, you read narratives that tell you the following. I've mentioned part of it in the past, that the Prophet ﷺ told Zayd to marry Zainab. Zainab didn't want to marry Zayd, and she didn't want to marry Zayd because he is a freed slave, and she sees herself as of honorable lineage and descent. And as the story goes, then they are married, but this language that you, Prophet, you are telling Zayd, don't divorce her, and you're hiding inside of yourself what God would reveal. And you are hiding inside of yourself what God would reveal because you fear people, and God, you should be fearful of God, not people. And thus, when Zayd's marriage with her came to an end, we had you, Muhammad, marry her. And you read a set of traditions that say that the Prophet went to visit Zayd and he wasn't home, but Zainab opened the door, and when he saw her, he was struck by her beauty. And when he saw how beautiful she is, and then later on, Zayd came to complain about her and say that, she doesn't treat me well, she's very rude to me. As the Prophet was telling him, don't divorce her, that at the same time he wanted to marry her. And that's what God was referring to, that that secretly you wanted to marry her, but you were telling him, don't divorce her, and fear God, don't divorce your wife. And what compounds, or what adds to this narrative, is that you have a report attributed to Aisha where she says no Quranic verse was harder on the Prophet than this Quranic verse وتخشى الناس وتخفي في نفسك ما الله مبديه وتخشى الناس والله حق أن تخشاه, that you are hiding, you're concealing what Allah intends to reveal, and you're hiding it because you're worried about what people would think, but you should be worried about God. Some other traditions say that if the Prophet would have concealed any part of the Quran, he surely would have concealed this verse. In other words, that since the Prophet is not the author of the Quran, so it's like saying, there's proof that the Prophet is not the author of the Quran, and that is that if in fact he was the author, he would surely would have hidden this part of the Quran because it's embarrassing. But then you pause, and there has already been a number of people who have investigated these traditions. And first, let's go back to the original. We have a number of narratives. We know that Zainab is the Prophet's cousin. They grew up together. There are, as I said, a narrative that says she was always in love with him, although it's an isolated narrative, Allahu Alam. And that he goes to her and he says, you should marry Zayd, and she doesn't want to marry Zayd, and she doesn't want to marry Zayd because of the difference in social status. But that eventually she says, okay, fine, I delegate you, it's up to you, you decide. And then she marries him, and many traditions about her not treating Zayd well. At least Zayd complains that she's not treating him well, that she doesn't like the way she talks to him, she doesn't like her attitude, etc., etc. Of course, the problem was the narrative about the Prophet seeing her and wanting her and then telling Zayd don't divorce her, but he's really concealing the desire to be married to her, is that it is not logical to say that the Prophet saw her for the first time when she opened the door, because he grew up with her. He's seen her a million times. And indeed, when you delve into this tradition that is a favorite of Islamophobes and Orientalists, it is among the Israelite traditions, meaning it was circulated by Jewish converts to Islam. And when you find, and there are key people that we always suspect that they converted to Islam in order to circulate traditions that impeach the character of the Prophet. Now, Zayd marries Zainab 8 years before the Hijrah. But divorces Zainab around 5 years after the Hijrah, around the incidents of the Battle of the Ahzab. Whether it overlaps or shortly after he divorces Zainab, he marries Ayman. Some sources say that he married Ayman before he divorced Zainab. Other sources say it was right after he divorced Zainab. But Ayman was a freed slave like Zayd himself. So in other words, the same status as him. And Ayman, in fact, she gives birth to a boy, and he's very happy with Ayman. And when Zayd goes to complain to the Prophet والسلام, that he wants to divorce Zainab, the Prophet knows that this marriage has been full of problems. Zayd has complained repeatedly about Zainab. And we have numerous traditions that, in fact, the Prophet, before the divorce incident, has gone to Zainab and tried to talk to her about improving her treatment of Zayd. After Zayd divorces Zainab, what do you think her status in society is? Zayd was known as the Prophet's adopted son, and although Surah Al-Ahzab comes and says, well, you can't give him your name, but he's still in a very special status. And now, this is the divorcee of the Prophet's ex-adopted son. And Zayd didn't just divorce her, but he divorced her after a whole legacy of complaints about her. Not surprisingly, you read that Zainab became seriously depressed and was weeping. And she's not weeping about the loss of Zayd, but she's weeping about her fate. Now, let me share with you this story that you don't find in Orientalist sources or in Islamophobic sources. So, Zayd goes to her eventually and tells her, when she sees him, she says, what brought, basically she doesn't want to talk to him. And he said, I've come to you with news. And news that will end your sorrow and basically mend your heart. And what news? He says, the Prophet is proposing to you. And she responds by saying, I will not agree until I consult my God. And then she goes and prays on it before she gives him a response. Now, what the personality of Zainab that emerges from this, she's not a lightweight. She's not a person that just receives orders. Even when she gets a proposal from the Prophet, her response is, I need to do istikhara. Which is, when you think about the people, that it's mind-blowing, right? The other thing is that it is clear that it is well understood that this woman, after Zayd divorced her, had become like a pariah in society. And that when the Prophet ﷺ is telling Zayd, don't divorce her, although he knows that this is not a marriage that's working, he is not thinking of he's not thinking of what's good for the two, but he knows that this divorce will be of disastrous consequences to his cousin. Zayd will have no problem remarrying, as he did, because he married Ayman, and there's even reports that he married a woman called Kulthum, who was the first woman to migrate from Mecca to, first Meccan woman to migrate from Mecca to Medina. But some commentators said that what the Prophet was concealing, and they relied on a tradition that said that Allah told the Prophet that this is going to become your wife, and that when the Prophet told Zayd, don't divorce her, he was telling him this knowing that this is a doomed marriage. I have serious doubts about this tradition. For one thing, I find it very doubtful that Allah would tell the Prophet that this is going to be your wife, and the Prophet would still tell Zayd, no, keep her. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, if you get a command from Allah that this marriage should end, it's unthinkable to me that the Prophet would even hesitate. But considering that this is his cousin, considering that we know what that divorce meant, although she didn't exactly, it was clear that she didn't like being married to Zayd, whatever the reasons are. But the only solution to rehabilitate, to compensate this woman for the divorce from the de facto son of the Prophet, was for the Prophet or someone of his status to marry her. And if it is true that she was always in love with the Prophet, Allahu Alam if it's true, and Allahu Alam if he knew that, even if it was true. But what is clear is that this narrative about the Prophet seeing her and then falling and saying, oh, she's so beautiful, and it's just complete nonsense. Okay. Now, so what is it when you go back to this verse? وما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم. When that, this is verse 36. No believer should have a choice if Allah and the Prophet decide something. When you look in the commentaries, most of them tell you what this is talking about is that when it's talking about that when the Prophet told Zainab to marry Zayd, that she should have married him immediately without argument. But we know that this is not consistent with women having freedom of choice. So many commentators come and say, well, this is an exception to the rule of women having freedom of choice, because it's like an exception by superior command, by the command of the high executive, this type of thing. I think the answer, we don't need to go this far. I think the answer is rather obvious. What the Quran, the tone of 36 is faulting someone. It's saying, it's like pointing out someone's error. The error here is the moral error in it's not the it's not saying that Zainab should have married Zayd right away, which she did ultimately, but that when the Allah and the Prophet tell people that social status should not be an impediment to marriage, that's what they should have obeyed immediately. It doesn't matter whether Zainab, you should marry Zayd or not, but you should have immediately accepted the moral lesson that the fact that this is a freed slave should not make you have an attitude. Zainab understood from this verse that it was sort of blaming her. But I think people are misreading Zainab's sense of guilt. She's not guilty because she didn't marry Zayd right away. I mean, this was, years ago. And ultimately she told the Prophet, you decide. No, it's her attitude. It's her attitude at the marriage and attitude after the marriage. She constantly would tell Zayd, you're a freed slave and I am from an honorable family. That's what is, and this is, was it considering that this is what Zayd was complaining about here? Was it wrong for the Prophet, as a few commentators said, to then tell him, don't divorce her, knowing that she degraded him? Because most modern commentators won't even touch this. But I think it is actually quite reasonable that if Allah is chiding the Prophet for anything, is that, listen, this woman has a superior attitude to this man. She takes this man for granted. She doesn't treat him well. Why are you telling him, don't divorce her? Because you are embarrassed about the marriage that you arranged having failed? Because you are worried that your cousin is going to be undesirable and unmanageable? Because you're worried that this is your adopted son but this is your blood, and that's what makes perfect sense. You are thinking of considerations other than the principles and the morality involved. And that's what's inappropriate. Then but when Allah says that we then had you marry her so that people will know that this whole thing about, just because an adopted son is not a real son, so you can marry the wives of your adopted son. Does this mean we've had you marry her by telling you, Muhammad, marry her? Or by basically the way Allah decides the fate of everything? So, I tend to think that it was not a divine command, but it's as if Allah is saying, you should not have, these people married because of your intervention, and yes, the marriage failing, and especially that this is your adopted son and this is your cousin, is embarrassing, but you should not have opposed the divorce because it's not right that Zayd would put up with this type of behavior, and you've tried to get her to stop treating him as inferior, and she never responded. But then Allah solved this problem. Allah had Allah's own reasons, and Allah's own reasons is to make it a point. You, Muhammad, married her because you wanted to mend her broken heart and basically save her from the very awkward position she was left in after the divorce. But Allah wanted you to marry her for something completely different. And that's to make a point about adoption, etc., etc. Now, it is very significant, as we will see, that yet again, when we get to the story of Zayd, we get to something full of ambiguity. Here, the historical facts are far more ascertainable, but it takes work. And again, if you're ill-intentioned, you will read the historical facts in a skewed way. If you're well-intentioned, you will read the historical facts in a very different way. A theme is emerging here. Throughout Surah Al-Ahzab, you have historical facts that teeter on the borders of ambiguity. And these historical facts can be read in a Nurani way, in a way full of light, or they can be read in a Dhalami way, in a way full of darkness. Okay, pause. Think about that. Think about that. Do you notice something? What do we do when we construct reality? We make an interpretive choice. And we can either defer to what Allah tells us to believe in, or what we can defer to what we want to believe in. And we say, boy, wait, Surah Al-Ahzab so far is full of this same dynamic. It's as if the entire surah is a demonstration of the interpretive choice and the way you are going to navigate, the way you establish facts in life and believe facts in life. Keep this in mind. Let's take a 2-minute break and then come back to it. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, as we said that, so there are I mean, I've emphasized that when Zayd goes to Zainab after her divorce, the reports say that كانت تبكي حسرة, she was weeping because of the state that she was left in after her divorce. And it's when people would try to would tell Zainab, you're the woman who Zayd, uh, the Prophet's adopted son, divorced. Basically putting her down. Her response would be, "I am the woman uh, God God ordained my marriage over seven heavens." So I mean, it's clear that this was a point of pride for her, and um, uh, something that boosted up her morale and her position socially. Although it's clear as well that the Quran reprimands her for uh, failing to live up to the ideals of the Quran, in having such a hard time accepting uh, that she's married to someone who used to be a slave. Okay, so then Surah Al-Ahzab, let's see, so moves on from there. ما كان على النبي من حرج فيما فرض الله له سنة الله الذي خلوا سنة الله الذي في الذين خلوا من قبل وكان أمر الله قدرا مقدورا الذين يبلغون رسالات الله ويخشونه ولا يخشون أحدا إلا الله وكفى بالله حسيبا ما كان محمد أبا أحد من رجالكم ولكن رسول الله وخاتم النبيين وكان الله بكل شيء عليما يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا الله ذكرا كثيرا وسبحوه بكرة وأصيلا هو الذي يصلي عليكم والملائكة ليخرجكم من الظلمات إلى النور وكان بالمؤمنين رحيما. تحيتهم يوم يلقونه سلام وأعد لهم أجرا كريما يا أيها النبي إنا أرسلناك شاهدا ومبشرا ونذيرا وداعيا إلى الله بإذنه وسراجا منيرا. Okay. Let's see, Muhammad. Translation. So now we are at 38. So then 38. Hence, no blame whatever attaches to the Prophet for having done what God has ordained for the Prophet. Indeed, such was God's way with those that have passed away aforetime. The Sunnat Allah في الذين خلوا من قبل. Okay? And remember that God's will is always destiny absolute, and such will always be God's way with those who convey God's messages to the world and stand in awe of God, and hold none but God in awe, for none can take count of man's doing as God does. And know, O believers, that Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but is God's apostle and the seal of all prophets, and God has indeed full knowledge of everything. O you who have attained to faith, remember God with unceasing remembrance, and extol God's limitless glory from morn to evening. وَسَبِّحُوهُ بُكْرَةً وَأَصِيلًا. Okay. God it is who bestows God's blessings upon you with God's angels echoing God, so that God might take you out of the depths of darkness into light. And indeed, a dispenser of grace is God unto the believers. On the day when they meet God, they will be welcomed with the greeting, peace, and God will have ready for them a most excellent reward. And as for thee, O Prophet, behold, we have sent you as a witness to the truth, and as a herald of glad tidings, as a warner. and as one who summons all people to God by God's leave, and as a light-giving beacon, وَسِرَاجًا مُنِيرًا. So, if you're not paying attention, you'll miss a lot here. Let's break it down a bit. Okay. So first, Allah tells us, ما كان على النبي من حرج فيما فرض الله له, that Allah ordains things for the Prophet, a special status for the Prophet. And understand that there is a special status for the Prophet. سنة الله في الذين خلوا من قبل. But then say that, and remember that in fact this is Allah's sunnah, this is Allah's way as to those before you. Here Allah is alerting us that prophets have always had a special dynamic with Allah that defined their historical role in specific ways. And indeed, because of what's going to come in Surah Al-Ahzab, Prophet Moses, for instance, is reported to have married X number of marriages, and it's trying to figure out exactly how many women he married is a near historical impossibility. It is a historical. Or Prophet Solomon, or Dawood alayhi salam, or David. Prophets are human beings. In a sense, they are thoroughly contextual, because in a sense they function within their historical context and perform roles within their historical context. And like for instance, the story of Khidr in the Quran, who is receiving special revelation that even Moses cannot understand, as recipients of the divine message, they have a special status. In other words, the facts of their life demonstrate a privity and an exclusivity to the role as prophets. In the same way that Allah told us that the wives of the prophets are like no other women, the Prophet himself is playing a very specific historical function. And that this is the way of God with all the prophets. But at the same time, and that there is, however, the ultimate moral here is that to learn that you must stand by God's message, convey God's message, and fear none but God. This principle is something that we share with the prophets. While we are not recipients of revelations, We don't have special circumstance. God doesn't tell us marry this person, don't marry this person. But we are under the same obligation that when we answer to someone, we answer only to God and none but God. But then Allah comes and says, and remember that Muhammad is not the father of any of your men. Well, obviously here is a reference again to the fact that Zayd is not to be treated as the Prophet's son, but that it is intentional that the Prophet would not have a male heir. And in fact, we are told this right before we are told that the Prophet is Khatamun Nabiyyin, that he is the seal. If he wasn't the seal, the line of having male children would continue because the line for prophecy would continue. But it has to come to an end because he's the seal. Then Allah tells us, now, so this prophet is the seal. This prophet doesn't have an heir. When this prophet dies, there will be no prophet that inherits the role of the prophet, like we've seen with the whole line of Abrahamic prophets. Okay, so we understand that. So what do? And Allah's response is again quite remarkable. اذكروا الله ذكرا كثيرا وسبحوه بكرة وأصيلا. You want to know what you do? You have no other recourse than the constant dhikr, night and day. Dhikr here doesn't mean that you sit and you say subhanallah, 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 but to be God conscious constantly. Okay? And in fact, this is the key to a dynamic, a critical dynamic, that you engage in constant dhikr, be God conscious, because in return, what Allah does for you is something quite remarkable. The angels, and here the angels is symbolic for the heavens, that indeed Allah and the angels, both, the heavens, is constantly in a state of prayer over you, constantly in a state of supplication over you. So that you may exit from darkness to light. There is a report transmitted here that Musa alayhi salam said to the Israelites something very different, something very similar. Be in constant remembrance of God, so that God and the angels may pray over you. And the Israelites then reportedly mocked Moses and told him, your God and the angels pray? How could God and the angels pray? And that this bothered Moses enormously. And that Moses then God told Moses, tell your people قل لهم إني أصلي وإن صلاتي رحمتي وإن رحمتي وسعت كل شيء. That my prayer is that my compassion would extend to all. Okay, so prophecy will end. Your path is the path of dhikr. The dhikr is the key to a reciprocal dynamic, and the reciprocal dynamic is that Allah and you would be in the mind of Allah and the angels, so much so that you are the recipients of God's mercy in this magnanimously beautiful image that Allah and the angels are literally praying night and day so that you may exit from darkness to light. And this is why, for instance, all the ahadith that say, where the Prophet ﷺ is asked about fadlu dhikr, and he says dhikr is of a greater reward than even jihad. And Ibn Abbas says that Allah made for every farida an ajal ma'loom illa dhikrullah, that Allah has decreed religious duties. Each duty has defined contours except dhikr. Dhikr is a fluid duty. It's a never-ending duty. It is the key to mercy and the key to light. But then look at what follows this. Okay, so then it tells us something about the Prophet. The Prophet himself is sent as shahid, a witness, wa mubashir, someone who brings good tidings, wa nadhir, a warner, wa da'iyan ila Allah bi'iznih, and the bridge, the inviter to Allah, the bridge to Allah, وَسِرَاجًا مُنِيرًا. Now, a beacon of light. So, and it will follow this by saying to the Prophet, ﷺ, forget about the hypocrites. Right? This is 48. Forget about the hypocrites. You have a much bigger role. Now, pause here and think of where Surah Al-Ahzab has taken us so far. It has informed us this is the seal of the prophets. This is it. It has informed us that the household of the Prophet is a moral example in our midst. Ahlul Bayt. But at the same time, it has left us with the reality of the actual reality that although Ahlul Bayt in principle is a moral example, Ahlul Bayt includes those who are of ambiguous status, people we don't even know if they actually married the Prophet. Those that we know for sure they married the Prophet, but we don't know much about the role, like Sauda herself, or like Zainab herself, except for like very specific episodes. But then with that, we have Ahlul Bayt like Ali and Fatima and Hassan Hussein, who we know a great deal. But then it comes and it anchors the Prophet ﷺ and says, the Prophet to you is a beacon of light. Now, this is a subtle point, but a very critical point. Let's say I want to understand the ways that the Prophet is a beacon of light. And I approach the issue from how many wives did the Prophet marry? The narratives about, and let's say I approach it like so many Muslims do. You know, read the story about, oh, he saw Zainab and he was so impressed by her beauty and he wanted to marry her, and, you know, all that nonsense. Oh, did he marry this? Did he have the slave girl? Did he not have the slave girl? And all the historical the historical ambiguities, like the historical ambiguities that surround Solomon, David, Musa. We haven't even talked about the historical ambiguities that surround a character like Isa, because the Bible itself is full of contradictions, which is our main source about who Isa was and what Isa did and so on. To what extent can the Prophet ﷺ become a Siraj Munir for you, a beacon of light for you? I would submit to you, you can spend your entire life so thoroughly submerged in the historical narratives, back and forth, and the Prophet ﷺ would not play any role as a beacon of light to you. The only way that the Prophet would become a beacon of light, a Siraj Munir, it's like those who spend their entire life. It's like, I remember this obnoxious kid once came to me, you know, typical, why did Imam Hassan marry all these? And he wanted to pull me into all the historical debates about how many women Imam Hassan had married, how many slaves did he have, all are historically contested facts. It's impossible to ascertain historical facts with certitude. Why? Because Imam Hassan was a highly historically contested figure. There were many political motivations to either make him look good or make him look bad. And because of that, you will always have traditions back and forth, back and forth. To what extent can I access the Ahlul Bayt as a Siraj Munir from the historical narratives? My answer is You can't. You must be aware as you approach history that you have a choice as to what to believe. And you can believe, you can start with the presumption of what I need to know about this historical legacy is anchored in the ethical principles I learned from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the extent that the Prophet is a beacon of light to me is accessed through dhikr, not through historical investigations. Everyone that felt the Islamic history is replete with poetry about the love of the Prophet, Hubb al-Rasul. When did the love of the Prophet fall out of the hearts of Muslims? When Muslims, their relationship to the Prophet became negotiated through the discourses of Orientalism and counter-Orientalism. When it became a matter of this tradition, this report, rather than a personal relationship with the Prophet ﷺ and Ahlul Bayt, the only way that you can have a love of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt is to start with the premise that they are a beacon of light. And that takes priority over all. And your personal relationship with that beacon of light is firmly anchored before you even get. You can engage in historical debates as a scholarly, intellectual curiosity, but they are not the basis upon which you define your relationship. It's in the same way, put it this way. Someone who starts out by saying, I cannot see God as my guide from light to darkness unless first I address all my logical objections about God. You will never reach God as a light, because eternity is not subject to any logical understanding. First beginnings is not subject to any logical understanding. The vastness of deity or the vastness of reality is not subject to any logical understanding. In the same way that I even can say that quantum physics itself is not logical, subject to any real logical understanding. There, you always will reach the incomprehensibles. If you insist on addressing the incomprehensibles before building a relationship with God, you will never get there. Even more so with the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ. When Allah says this Prophet is Siraj Munir, is a beacon of light, I'll put it to you the way one of my teachers once put it to me. You are never, if you tell yourself, I'm going to fall in love with the Prophet by reading all the books on Surah that exist in the universe, you will not fall in love with the Prophet. You fall in love with the Prophet by smelling the Prophet's perfume. By Allah giving you a sense of what that Prophet is. The presence of the Prophet. That's why Allah anchors it with dhikr first. Allah takes us through all these events that could fill tons of pages of scholarship, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Does Allah not know that there are all these historical ambiguities in Surah Al-Ahzab? Of course, Allah knows. Allah knows that we will be back and forth forever. But that's not the access to the Prophet. The access to the Prophet is like to attain a relationship with the Prophet becomes a beacon of light, is to start from the premise that if you're committed to Allah, the commitment to Allah, then Allah will not have Allah's representative on earth be but pure light. Now, so regardless of the historical evidence that I read, when my heart tells me that something I find in the tradition is not pure light, regardless, I will not accept it. My relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and with the Prophet tells me I cannot accept it. Eventually, I might, in fact, and it happened numerous times in my life, my scholarship eventually vindicates my skepticism. But even if it doesn't, I am more than happily at peace with the idea of going to my grave not knowing whether he married only 9 or more than 9 or less than 9. It has no bearing on the role of the Prophet as a Siraj Munir, as a beacon of light. So the approach itself, those who start by saying, first, before I develop a relationship with the Prophet, I must first satisfy all these questions that I have, you will end up exactly what Grace was mentioning, 1 and 4. Or those who say, oh, we can't use the hadith, we only can use the Quran. Your problem is not the lack of knowledge. Your problem is the lack of dhikr. The lack of a personalized relationship. If the Prophet ﷺ would have visited you once, all doubts would have melted away in an instant for the rest of your life. It is not a coincidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes after this journey and comes and says, understand, this is about a man who is beyond historical eventualities. If your only relationship to this prophet is through the assessment of historical facts and contingencies, you're going to miss the point. In the same way you can't access Allah this way, you can't access the Prophet this way. Remarkably, although Allah comes and with this introduction, the dhikr, Allah and the angels praying on us, and the Prophet being a Siraj Munir, it is amazing how often this culmination in Surah Al-Ahzab, that this Prophet is a Siraj Munir, is a beacon of light. This is why I told you Surah Al-Ahzab is like the close relative of Surah Al-Nur. But Surah Al-Ahzab comes and says, the light, the embodiment of God's final prophecy is light. And so the light can only be attained through light. And because what happens when you have that personal relationship is your very approach to history. Let me put it this way. There is a historian that Muslims have Muslims have written a lot of books in the modern age. Although a lot of these books are written to defend the Prophet ﷺ, they are not nearly as effective as the books that were written in a period in which, in the pre-modern period, where the authors were not concerned with defending the Prophet ﷺ. Why is it that with all the apologetics of modern writers, these historians, quote unquote, are not nearly as effective as even the people who were more like chroniclers, people, writers of chronicles, not really historians, but not even as effective as the difference is that a historian that approaches history with already a broken attitude, not sure of the ultimate worthiness of their subject matter, loses the battle from the beginning, because often what they're capable of seeing and noticing and the limits of their research is defined by their ideological stance. While if you have the moral confidence you have a level of bravery, daringness, assuredness, certitude that comes out in your methodology, in your style, in your tone, in everything. This is why so much of the modern scholarship written by Muslims is so ineffective. In the same way that Muslims have lost touch with the basic understanding of why is it that Islam takes people from darkness to light, they also don't understand the way that the Prophet is a beacon of light. Or they're not sure that the Prophet was indeed a beacon of light. So they try to, bolster this fact, fix this fact, argue this fact, but the defeat is within, deeply anchored, and so we never go anywhere. Okay. So we come to this pivotal point that this is the final prophet. And this prophet is a beacon of light. And that you must relate to this prophet as a beacon of light. It is not about the Prophet as an individual, as a person, but it is about this Prophet as a witness, a warner, i.e., what this Prophet represents for you. This is precisely, Allah comes and says, don't worry about, although for us it's not a petty thing, the harm or the shenanigans with the hypocrites. These people have withdrawn in the heart of battle, but it's like Allah coming and saying, this is beneath you. Don't worry about that. Your role is something very different. And so don't even worry about pursuing, everyone that came and said, can I withdraw and go take care of my home? You gave them permission until the majority was gone. Don't even worry about going after them or blaming them or ostracizing them or whatnot. Your role is something different. Like the role of Ahlul Bayt, your household. Okay. Then, like Surah An-Nur, after delivering this point, it goes back to addressing a law. But look, a specific law, but at the same time, immoral law. If you marry someone, and this is 49. If you marry someone, but you end up divorcing this person before you've consummate. So in other words, there was no consummation but a divorce. There's no waiting period. This was a question that was actually asked specifically, whether there's a waiting period if there's no consummation. But look, فَمَتِّعْهُنَّ وَسَرِّحُهُنَّ صَرَاحًا جَمِيلًا. Already in Surah Al-Baqarah, we were told that they are owed, if there's a marriage, divorce, but no consummation, that they're owed half the dowry. And a lot of commentators thought, well, then Surah Al-Baqarah, which was revealed earlier, abrogates Surah Al-Ahzab, or this verse in Surah Al-Ahzab, which was revealed later, which makes no sense. It has nothing to do with abrogation. That in Surah Al-Baqarah, you were told, give them half their dowry. But here it says, فَمَتِّعْهُنَّ وَسَرِّحُهُنَّ صَرَاحًا جَمِيلًا. Just because people, when they divorce without consummation, there's always a reason that's not pleasant. People don't divorce without consummation because they love each other. They divorce without consummation because after the marriage, but before consummation, a problem occurred. And Allah comes and says, even then, it is not just giving them half their dowry, but it is making sure that they're comfortable and that they're treated beautifully. Even then, that's no excuse for harshness, for hard feelings, for saying, well, since we didn't consummate, I want my presents back, for instance, or I want the wedding gifts back, your attitude is precisely like the attitude you would have if you have a prophet who's a beacon of light. Surah An-Nur said, spread the light. Surah Al-Ahzab comes and says, this is a beacon of light. Be careful that when you understand the example of your prophet, that the normative commitments you make, the interpretive acts you take, must always be on the side of light. I'm going to jump ahead to just alleviate a little bit of the anxiety. You see, think of how Surah Al-Ahzab ends. Surah Al-Ahzab comes and says, Allah gave the trust. What is the trust? The intellect. It started out with how you construct reality. It ended with the legacy and the trust of the intellect. Do you see a connection between the two? And in the middle, the Prophet as a beacon of light. So you are going to use the intellect. You are going to be constructing your reality, following the sunnah of the Prophet didactically, blindly, saying, this hadith says, let me recite to you, brother, this hadith, follow this hadith. No. You are going to be making normative moral commitments all the time. You are going to be deciding what to believe and what to follow. You are going to be interpreting all the time. And you better do it in the course of the light. You have a choice. You could go to Banu Nadir and say, yes, I follow the hadith, execute 600, 700 men, no problem. I have no problem with that. But have you thought about the Prophet as Siraj Munir? You could say, oh yes, I see no problem. Prophet saw a woman, he thought she was beautiful, he desired her, told her husband, don't divorce her, but then he really wanted her. But then you're making an interpretive choice. Have you thought of the Prophet as a beacon of light? God can't give you the answers. God can give you a methodology. It started out with, how do you construct reality? Ends with your intellect. In the middle is the beacon of light. What time is it?
9:20.
Now, look at this example. So, this is now, we're going to go to verse 50. It's going to have to do 50 and 51. Well, okay, let's see how far we'll go. Okay. Ya ayyuhan Nabi, okay, so Allah speaking to the Prophet in 50, behold, we have made lawful إن أحللنا لك أزواجك اللاتي آتيت أجورهن وما ملكت يمينك مما أفاء الله عليك وبنات عمك So we've jumped ahead earlier and dealt with this somewhat. The Prophet, behold, we've made lawful to you your wives that you paid dowries to, We, and those who your right hands possess, who come to possess me as captives of war, basically, so you can marry a captive of war. And we've made lawful to you the daughters of your paternal uncles, and we've talked about this, the Banu Hashim, and the daughters of your maternal uncle, the Banu Zahra, from your father's side, but as long as they migrated with you, and we've talked about that here, while, for instance, a Muslim can marry a Christian or Jew, or can marry someone who is not related, the Prophet is limited as to who may be potentially a part of his Ahlul Bayt. And clearly that the range of women that the Prophet can pick from is limited, is setting constraints that we can speculate as to why he would be so constrained, but we can't really figure out the reason. Okay, and a woman who comes, wabat nafsaha lin-nabi, that a woman who comes and says, I follows the procedure of hiba, means that marry me without a dowry. And as we said, that this was made allowable to the Prophet ﷺ, but was abrogated, that marriage without a dowry was not allowed to anyone else. Okay. So we have already made known what we have enjoined upon them with regard to their wives and whom the bride's hands possess. Okay. So this is verse 50. And we notice immediately not just the ambiguity about the marriages of the Prophet, but this whole procedure of a woman who gives herself to the Prophet to marry her without a dowry. This itself, you nearly get nowhere about. So Ibn Abbas, for instance, and Mujahid says the Prophet never married a woman through the process of hiba. So in other words, the Prophet never married any woman without a dowry. Other sources, if you look in even like in any of the longer tafsir, they will tell you, well, it's debated whether he married this woman as a hiba, and when you look into the various traditions, you enter a maze without resolution. You spend an enormous amount of time, and you find that those he said he never married any woman without a dowry are on solid grounds, and those who say that he married X woman without a dowry have ample support as well. None of it is mutawatir, all of it's ahad, but nevertheless, it's traditions that literally a jungle of traditions that tell you both at the same time. And so and remember, this is the verse we jumped ahead to sort of we dealt with earlier by jumping ahead, and then now we come back to it again. And what is also involved in this verse is when Allah says that, you know, your maternal side, your paternal side, your maternal side, etc., is this narrowing the pool, and for what purpose? So this will become clear even a bit more. But if you look at 51, so ترجي من تشاء منهن وتؤوي إليك من تشاء. So you mayest, as Muhammad as puts it, know that you mayest put off for a time whichever of them you please, and mayest take unto you whichever you please. ومن ابتغيت ممن عزلت فلا جناح عليك. That, and if you seek out any from whom you have kept away for a time, you will incur no sin. Okay. ذلك أدنى أن تقر أعينهن ولا يحزن ويرضين بما أتيتهن كلهن. So this will make it more likely that their eyes are gladdened whenever they see you, and that they do not grieve whenever they are overlooked, and that all of them may find contentment in whatever you has to give them. For God alone knows what is in their hearts, and God is indeed all-knowing and forbearing. Okay. والله يعلم ما في قلوبكن وكان الله عليما حليما. Then لا يحل لك النساء من بعد ولا أن تبدل بهن من أزواج ولو أعجبك حسنهن إلا ما ملكت يمينك وكان الله على كل شيء قديرا. So no woman shall henceforth be lawful to you, nor are you allowed to supplant, and we've talked about the badal, where you exchange your wife or you switch wives, to any of them by other wives, even though their beauty should please you greatly. None shall be lawful to you beyond those whom you already has come to possess, meaning that already you're married to, and God keeps watch over everything. Okay. We've already said that there is this debate as to whether 52 is saying the women that you are currently married to, and normally the presumption is that he's married to 9 at this point, is that you may not marry more than 9, or is it, as we've said, is it saying that you may not marry beyond the limit set in the earlier verse, meaning you may not marry beyond women who are related to you on your maternal side or paternal side and who migrated with you. So, and as I said, that for apologetic reasons, Muslims sort of swept that whole debate under the rug and said, well, no, it's just limiting the Prophet to these 9 women, and that's it. And as I said, that there are even all these debates about whether the Prophet married someone in the 7th year Hijrah, married a woman even in the 9th Hijrah, whether when the Prophet died, he was planning to marry a woman that And I've told you that there are the issue with the marriages of the Prophet is that upon the death of the Prophet, all types of tribes wanted to claim a relation to the Prophet. Quraysh was saying the Prophet is from us. But Quraysh wanted to say, well, the Prophet being from us, it is us, Quraysh, who is entitled to govern or to rule. Banu Hashim were saying, this is unfair. If the Prophet is from Quraysh, well, you guys fought him for most of his life. You were actually not even nice to him. If anything, should be from Banu Hashim. But in the same way that you had Quraysh making this claim and Banu Hashim making this claim, you had tribes from Ghatafan to Al-Asd to Banu Zuhra to tribes from all over that wanted to claim, well, we had a woman married to the Prophet, or we had a woman that the Prophet was planning to marry. That political incentive created and incentivized historical narratives that are very difficult to decipher through. There are some women that were just too well established, like Aisha or Sauda. But beyond that, the personal lives of prophets, become severely contested right upon their death. It is as if everyone wants to pierce the veil of the Prophet's privacy to say we had an intimate connection. Even those who claimed to be prophets after the Prophet, so even those who became false prophets, still wanted to claim that they had a lineage, a marital lineage to the Prophet, so that they can say, before his death, the Prophet said, I share my prophecy with Musaylama, or I share my prophecy with this person. So the realm of marriage and intimacy became hotly contested. The only line, and this is my opinion, the only line that, despite the numerous attempts to corrupt, remained pristine and pure, is the line of Banu Abdul Muttalib, the lineage to Imam Ali and Fatima and Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein. And that is why they occupy a special place. The Umayyads would always say, what is this? Why are you supporting the faction of Ali? Aren't we Ahlul Bayt as well? Because of this marriage, because Bint Uthman, for instance, was married to the Prophet, right? Or Bint Abu Bakr was married to the Prophet, or Hafsa Bint Umar married to the Prophet. So it'd say, well, aren't we Ahlul Bayt as well? But the response to this is, yes, but the historical record is so muddied. Subhanallah, the only clear the only part of that historical record where you can find a pristine moral leadership to the community is through the line of Imam Ali and Fatima and Hassan al Hussein. So they became a direct link to the role of a prophet as a siraj and al munir, a beacon of light. Now, look, when you look at 51, I'm not skipping it, but let's go back to 51. That you mayest put off for a time whichever who you please, or now this verse is telling the prophet after the ultimatum was given and the wives that chose to stay with the prophet stayed with the prophet, is telling the prophet that indeed when you deal within your household, you have discretion. Discretion, to put it simply, who you are intimate with, how often you are intimate with them. It's like saying this is a personal matter between you and your wives. Most Muslims have heard the hadiths that directly contradict this verse, in which the prophet supposedly declares that he's like a robot. He spends equal time with every wife on every occasion. When Allah speaks in this terms of this discretion, it's like saying it's between the prophet and his wives, butt out. You're not privy to their relationship, and you're not allowed to be privy to the relationship. Don't even talk about it. Did Muslims listen? No, they didn't. They still invented traditions to make the prophet either like a stud that sleeps with all his wives in one night, which is absurd, or like a monotone machine. These were affairs. A beacon of light cannot be, if he was living in our midst, we wouldn't be allowed to talk about how much time he spends with which wife or what happens in his household. Then how can you imagine that we would be allowed to talk about it 1400 years after the fact? Think about it, people. If the prophet was living in our midst, what happens between him and his wives is private. Any speculation would be exactly that. Speculation and namima and ghaiba. And you wouldn't be allowed to talk about it. But yet, Muslims, 1400 years after the fact, they think they're allowed to talk about it and speculate about it and have a crisis of faith because of it. These are not things within access. They're not related to the beacon of light. These are things between him and his wives. But look at the example of what we're saying, interpretations of light and interpretations of darkness. Supposedly, after the revelation of these verses 50 to 53, supposedly Aisha says, did Muhammad Asad write this? ما أرى ربك إلا يسارع في هواك. Supposedly, Aisha responds by saying, "Oh, I see your God is keen to accommodate your whims." Now, if she would have said that, that is a perfect example of an interpretation of darkness. I personally don't think that she said that. Allahu Alam. But whoever put that in the mouth of Aisha also is an example of an interpretation of darkness. You're taking something that is very private and you're spinning it the way human beings who don't see a prophet as a beacon of light would spin it. You can say, you can speculate like that about, you're not supposed to speculate like that about a teacher, about a moral example. So how about the prophet? But this is precisely when you reflect on Ahzab, and that Allah chose to tell us that the Prophet is a beacon of light and the last of the messengers in Surah Al-Ahzab, of all the surah, and you reflect upon, and then to begin it with the construction of reality and to end it with the intellect, and you ask, why Allah? And I think the answer is very clear. Because you are interpretive agents, and you are also moral agents. And if you are you are determined to look at the Prophet as a neutral beacon, nothing will change your mind. Your interpretive moves will reflect that choice. If you have a relationship with the Prophet and you know the Prophet to be a beacon of light, it will affect all your interpretive moves, all your choices as to how you construct reality and what reality you live in. And with this, let's stop here. Inshallah, we'll continue on Saturday. Inshallah, we'll finish Surah Al-Ahzab on Saturday. You hardly have an audience tonight, but come do the honors for our honored single guest, Rizwan. And Rizwan.
There's 11 on YouTube. And 11 on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Oh, 11?
Yeah, that's fine. Well, for all 12 of our blessed guests, alhamdulillah, the people who didn't sit through this don't know what they just missed out on, because I think this is the key to so much. And, subhanAllah, it's like you always say, we never plan out what, like, each other person, or I never tell you what I'm going to talk about in my introduction. I'm blessed that something tends to happen that will come up. And today's point about the people who leave Islam because of doubt, I think this so much answers that question. It's the missing link, right? Because we know so many Muslims that are dealing with doubt because they can't resolve this historical issue, this fact, this piece of evidence that's thrown at them. And what's clearly missing is this whole notion of this beacon of light. And everything comes back to something very simple, is the idea, like as we've been learning for so many surahs, and especially Surah Nur, either you're on the side of light or you're on the side of darkness. Either you are an instrument of light or you're not. Either you are on, in the party of Allah or on the party of darkness. And you oftentimes also in your scholarship have said that a text and how you approach the text is only as good as the morality of the reader. And that is again emphasized here, is like you can choose to highlight all of the ugly things in our tradition, or you can choose all of the beautiful things in the tradition. And now I understand where this came from through this journey. And then as something that I think is so beautiful too is, we often talk about like people who get caught in these academic or scholarly debates, and this idea that you don't need to be a scholar to understand light. To be a scholar, you can engage all of these, very difficult, nuanced, historical ambiguities and all of that. But this is what makes, I think, this tradition and this faith humanistic and beautiful and universal, is that God is speaking to us in a way that we understand. Either, you are emanating light or you're not. Either you're choosing light or you're not. And at the same time, empowering you with the idea you have a choice. You can affect how people see Islam, how people see God, how people see what beauty this faith calls for through your actions and through your choices, through your interpretive act as an agent of God. And especially now when people have such an issue with how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is being presented or attacked and personified. This is the key, is if you think of him, God tells you in the Quran that he's a beacon of light. That should be it. That should be the start and end of everything. That's the key to all of that doubt. So, alhamdulillah, thank you so much for taking us through this incredible journey, this incredible understanding. And we're not even done yet, right? We're not even finished with Surah Ahzab, so I know that there's still so much more to come. But just in this one surah, we've covered so much ground, and understanding that there was a purpose to demonstrate all of this ambiguity. Because you can, emerge from that and say, no, I choose the certainty of light. And that's such a powerful point of empowerment for each of us as individuals. So thank you so much. I can't wait for, inshallah, the conclusion on Saturday of Surah Ahzab, inshallah. Get your questions ready. Hopefully we will be able to cover those in a Q&A as well. So thank you everyone for being with us. Alhamdulillah. This was such a gift, and so happy that you were here to receive it with us. So, okay, everyone, have a wonderful rest of the week, and inshallah we will see you very soon. Wonderful to see you. Assalamu alaikum. Wow. Is it still a lot left?
Not a lot, but a very critical point that closes the circle.
Wow.
Now you know why. Now you understand why I was so burdened and pensive, and when I found out that it's Surah Al-Ahzab. It's like how. It's like you have to walk people step by step, so to get them to. I mean, once you see it, you can never forget it. You will. It will. And the more you think about it, the more you say it's obvious. It's like it's so obvious, but it's just.
But this is one of these surahs, though. It's not like it's like you said. It's not that you can just point out the moral points. Look at how much work you had to do to understand the history, the context, the people, what was going on, all of the, even historical ambiguity. You can't know if there's ambiguity if you don't know the entire, tradition of what people have said, what they've not said, how they conflict with one another. I mean, it's like it takes work to.
Yeah, I mean, and part of the reason it took so much work is because you have to work through all the stuff that's out there, and then step back and think about, one of the things that just always struck me is that none of them make a big point about that. At the center of the surah is Allah telling us that the Prophet is a beacon of light. they take it as if it's rhetorical flair. It's like, sounds good. But it's not a matter of sounding good. And why in Surah Al-Ahzab would Allah choose Surah Al-Ahzab to say this is the final prophet? Could have said it in Baqarah. Could have said it in Al Imran. You know, it would have could have said it in one of the short surah that, you know, but no, it's in Surah Al-Ahzab. And you know, so these things they become, and so at the same time that it's like, oh yeah, you know, God, it's like in the midst of this guy, yeah, I know that there are all those issues going on, family issues and so on. Well, let me tell you about the family issues. Butt out. You know, it's like, get out of the gutter. You know, clean your brain and just focus on what's. This is, yeah.